Hey everyone, it's January 27, 2014. I'm Rene Ritchie, and right now we're going to go over Apple's Q1 2014 financial results. This is the iMore Show. Chris Umiastowski, he writes Cross Mobile Nations, former sell-side analyst and generally smart guy about stocks, markets, and everything that goes with them. How's it going, Chris? Did I lose you, Chris?
No, you didn't lose me, but I've got the I've got the echo going. I'm trying to figure out where the sound is coming from. There it is. There it is. There it is. I got two instances of this thing going in the background. There we go. Okay, how's that, Rene?
Good.
Haha.
So let's start. Let's dive right in. Apple results today: 51 million iPhones. What were the iPad numbers? Let me just double check those.
26.
Yeah, 26 million iPads. The iPod market crashed. That's down 50%.
Yeah.
And what was the Mac number? I should have all this in front of me, but
4.8.
Yeah.
8 million Macs.
So what's your just general impression of those numbers? Wall Street, I don't know how to read them anymore. Well, I guess I never knew how to read them. They never made any sense to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, so the quarterly numbers for Q1, the quarter that they just reported, and people have to remember Apple's quarter is different than the calendar year. So they say Q1, that's the December quarter. The numbers were fine, but it's the guidance that, well, they weren't fine. The numbers were fine. The bottom line numbers were fine, but there's a disappointment on the number of iPhone sales. It was only 51 million, and the street was looking for a lot more than that, somewhere around 55 million. Earnings were fine. 14.50 earnings per share is strong, and the guidance was weak. So basically, if you look at the revenue guidance for next quarter, they're telling you there's no growth year over year. So people are looking at that going, come on, you've got China Mobile, that should be a tailwind, that should be helping your business. Why aren't you posting earnings growth? What's going on here? That's basically what's going on.
Tim Cook and Peter Oppenheimer both did a job trying to say that you should be looking at sell-through and not sell-in, and that there were four factors that would affect sell-in but not necessarily sell-through. That's hard for me to understand the difference.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the sell-in numbers were in the, or I guess obviously we do. Sorry, I don't know what the sell-through numbers were in the quarter, so I'm not really sure how much of a difference it is. I'm going to review it. I'm going to find the transcript and go through it, and probably tomorrow morning I'll write up a more detailed editorial for the site. But they say this every time. If you listen to Peter, when he answers questions about guidance, he pretty much has his 4 or 5 points that are driving the guidance every single call. And, you know, you can only make that same excuse so many times. I'm not saying that I didn't like Apple's numbers. I think the business is doing just fine and all that, but every quarter he's going to say, well, you know, difference between sell-in and sell-through and foreign exchange headwinds and this and that. You know, you can only you know, in a what am I trying to say here, Rene? In a one-quarter scenario, if you're just looking at a quarter in isolation, you could maybe go, all right, I understand that. But if he's making the same kind of excuses quarter after quarter, the street stops listening.
So he basically said it was channel inventory increases, lower iPod sales, which we saw was about 50% down, stronger US dollar versus yen and Australian dollar, and higher per unit deferral. And they did say that they're deferring way more iPhone and way more Mac revenue than ever before, largely because Mavericks is now free, iWork and iLife are now free with the purchase of a new device.
Yeah, okay, so this is something I need to look into because I heard them say that, but I don't know what the numbers are. And I mean, I really want to know what are the actual numbers. How many dollars of an iPhone or an iPad are being deferred? If it's a significant difference, then that's a very fair comment, and you have to make some sort of adjustment to come up with an apples-to-apples, no pun intended, comparison.
Yeah, they had their new controller, Luca, and I forget his last name on, and he went through some of those numbers. But the question came back to Cook on whether the high end of the smartphone market, at least the way Apple currently attacks it, is growing saturated, and also why Apple is experiencing 7% growth in the high end of the market rather than the 14% growth in the market in general.
Yeah, well, I think that the high end of the market isn't going to grow as fast as the overall market.
Oh, I apologize, I misspoke. The overall market growth, 7% versus 14%.
Oh, overall, sports 7%. Yeah, so, and of course, Apple being a player in the high end primarily, that's what I mean. So I think we're on the same page here. So I think it's fair to say that right now the overall market is probably going to outgrow Apple just because they only compete at the high end. And sorry, I'm looking at the video myself here. I'm eating a little chocolate, so don't let that disturb you. Apple, if they want to bring more products in to the lower end of the market, they could probably grow at least as well as the market. But I don't know. I was listening to Tony Saganacci's question there. He was really pushing Tim Cook on growth and why is it that for 30 quarters out of the last 31, the Mac was not only an amazing product but outgrew the market, and that's not happening with the iPhone. And I don't think that's a very fair question because it has happened. It just happened a whole lot more in a whole lot shorter time period. I mean, they've gone from nothing to significantly dominant in this space in a very short period of time compared to the Mac versus the PC, right?
These questions usually lead to the follow-up of why isn't Apple in the low end of the market, although traditionally that end of the market doesn't make any revenue, and Tim Cook pointed out that even though they're not in the low end of the market, they've had significant growth in countries like Japan and China, and they've had significant growth in markets that some people would refer to as emerging markets. Japan growth, I think, was up 40%, and mostly on the back of .como coming online. Sorry,
yeah, I heard him say, he said the same thing. Japan was up 40%. They've only been selling in China Mobile for like a week now, and that there's only 16 cities, and there's supposed to be 300 by year end, so they got to build out a whole bunch more. China Mobile's going to build out a bunch of 4G base stations. I mean, I'm not really sure what to think. I mean, there's clearly a lot of growth at the high end of the market in many markets. I mean, just look at totally separate market, but I'm a big fan of Tesla Motors. And they are announcing their pricing in China. Well, they're selling the car in China, and they're going to sell tons of these cars in China, even though it's a very, very expensive car. And Mercedes, I think, sells more of its high-end vehicles in China than it does in the United States. So expanding into a new market is going to get you a lot of sales, especially if it's a huge market like China. But I still think overall the market is going to grow faster than a player who is only competing in the high end of the market when you've got something like, I can't remember what the percentages are right now, Rene, but something like, let's say, half the market is still not using a smartphone.
Now, one of the things that they also said was that they were surprised by the mix. They didn't anticipate the mix to go as much towards the iPhone 5S as it did, but people really liked Touch ID and they really liked the advanced technologies. They ended up buying more 5Ss than Apple expected, and maybe they didn't have the revenue, or they didn't have the capacity to fill all those orders, at least initially. Yeah,
and they said they were supply constrained at the end of the quarter, right?
Yeah, they had increased. I think they're in balance for everything as of now, which was faster than they got in balance last year. But I think they were surprised by the demand for 5S initially.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I've seen a lot more 5Ss than I have 5Cs, and I think that just that's what people are buying, right?
They wouldn't break out the new iPhone market. They said that amongst first-time iPhone buyers, a 5C was a very popular alternative. Or they said the 5C was doing very well with first-time iPhone buyers.
Yeah, and that's important to just get people into the Apple platform. Now, you notice the ASP, the average selling price, also went up significantly this quarter, which is a reflection of that 5S demand. So it was $637 per phone on average versus $577 last quarter. So that's a pretty big bump up, which explains why they were able to beat on earnings despite not shipping as many as Wall Street thought they would.
Yeah, they shipped less units, but they shipped a higher mix of the more costly units, or the more valuable units.
Exactly. Now so iPhone and iPad's doing great. iPhone, it seems like there's some questions about growth at the high end. What else are they going to do?
They also said that U.S. carrier, the upgrade cycle was different than they expected because they said the U.S. carriers had changed the rules on upgrades for them.
Yeah, now that's interesting because for years, people have said, okay, look, the carriers can't really afford to put that kind of heavy subsidy onto a phone. That's going to lead to pressure. Eventually, prices have to drop. We'll see. I don't know. I mean, do you think that carriers are going to end up being able to apply more pressure to Apple, causing them to either lower the price or somehow otherwise harm Apple in the United States, or are people going to, are there just so much money to be made by selling data plans on these things that enough people want iPhones, it's not going to matter. Apple's going to get its way.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen what happens to carriers when they don't have an iPhone. I mean, it hurt Verizon initially. It still hurt T-Mobile up until recently. T-Mobile said as much, said it was harming their revenue levels by not having it. What I think they're doing though is they're transferring that pain to the customer now in a sneaky way, like with the Next plans and things like that, where you're essentially leasing the phone. Sometimes with a rebate, sometimes you're paying the subsidy on top of that, and they expect the phone back when you do the early upgrade. And I think that's still confusing, and that hasn't shaken out yet.
Okay. So we'll have to see what happens, because that's been one of the long-term arguments is pricing is going to get tougher in the U.S. market because you've got all these pretty good Android phones on the market, and they're going to be at lower subsidy levels, and the carriers are going to apply pressure to Apple. And if Apple wants to play at the high end, well, there's other high-end Android phones that cost less. Yada, yada, yada. It's going to apply pressure, and it's going to come in terms of gross margin pressure for Apple. But then you look at high-end Samsung phones like the Galaxy S4 right now. I mean, it isn't a cheaper phone. I mean, if you go to buy it outright not on a contract, it costs like $600, right? So it's not as if the super high-end Android stuff is much cheaper than an iPhone. So I'm not sure I totally buy that argument, but I understand it at least. It's just one of the long-term threats.
One of the things people keep pushing Apple towards is this idea of going to the cheap market. And again, I think like netbooks, Apple believes that they can actually make more money in the long run by issuing that. But one of the things we've been hearing rumors about is a bigger screened iPhone. And Tim Cook, of course, wouldn't talk about products they hadn't shipped yet. They did say there were new categories. They did say there would be new devices, and of course there will be both. But creating a larger screened iPhone, it kind of reminds me of back in the day when Apple was only on AT&T. The iPhone was only on AT&T. So your choice was to get an iPhone on AT&T or something else on Verizon. And to AT&T's benefit, tons of people switched to AT&T just to get the iPhone. But there were some people who just couldn't stand or couldn't use AT&T, and they didn't get an iPhone. When they went to Verizon, when they went to Sprint, T-Mobile, they grew their addressable market considerably. And I'm wondering if now there are people who would love to have an iPhone, but they just need a larger screen device. Their primary computing device has to be a phone, and that means they require a larger screen for accessibility issues or productivity issues. And they would love an iPhone, but it's just not big enough. So if Apple made a bigger screen iPhone, it would be the same thing as when they went on Verizon. People would no longer have to choose. They could get iOS on a bigger device, which might hurt, because those are premium devices. Those are not budget devices. That might take away a differentiator for their competitors and, once again, increase their addressable market.
Yeah, I would agree that there's a range of desires among the audience, and some people want a bigger phone. Now, I think Apple's never said they wouldn't do one. They've just said the screen's not good enough yet, and we're not going to make a crappy phone just because people want a bigger screen. So they'll just wait until, and maybe that's now, when the screen technology is, in their opinion, good enough to go larger, and then I think they'll do it.
One of the other things we heard was mobile payments. There's been some rumblings about Apple and mobile payments recently. They asked Tim Cook about Touch ID and the App Store, because right now you can buy music and movies and iOS apps using Touch ID, and he said people love it. I mean, he said the iPhone 5S mix was higher because of Touch ID. He said people love using Touch ID. He went so far as to say that because the numbers, and we saw all the holiday numbers, Chris, people are using iOS 2 times more to browse, 4 times more to browse, twice more to buy, some huge number like that. I forget the details, but e-commerce on iOS is factorially larger than it is in any other platform, and that they had mobile payments in mind when they developed Touch ID.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't doubt that for a second. I think it makes so much sense. I mean, I don't really have a lot of experience on the product itself because I don't have a Touch ID device in my home. But it makes so much sense that if you're going to use the Touch ID to log on, you're going to use the Touch ID to pay. It's a beautiful thing. I mean, can imagine, since I think they're storing Touch ID passwords in the cloud too, or passwords, you know what I mean, fingerprints, right? Is that part of iCloud too?
No, iCloud will the only thing they're doing with that is iCloud keychain. The Touch ID is actually really secure. Basically, as soon as you touch the sensor, the metal ring realizes a finger there, activates the sensor, takes a shot of your thumb, convert or your whatever finger, converts it into an encrypted mathematical formula, sends it through the hardware channel to a paired CPU. So if you try to swap Touch ID sensors, it doesn't even work. And then the secure enclave on the Apple A7 chip releases a yes or no token. So it's almost impossible to get anything out of that device. Even if you can't get it out of RAM, you can't get it out of anything. It's a really secure implementation.
Okay, so it is truly stored only on the device. I was thinking if they stored some kind of highly encrypted version of your fingerprint in their cloud, then they could even put Touch IDs, devices right on payment terminals in a store. You wouldn't even need to use your phone to pay. But that said, I think I should just forget about what I said, because it makes a whole lot more sense to do it securely through your phone and do it through a Bluetooth connection or just not even Bluetooth, I guess. Yeah, wouldn't be Bluetooth. You'd have to pair. It would just be networked. And I mean, I think that'll proliferate. It makes a lot of sense. It really does. I mean, why not? But there's another thing I want to talk about, and that is the operating expenses. So notice they have gone up significantly this quarter. I don't have the numbers. Actually, I do. I have it in Numbers, my spreadsheet app here. So operating expenses went up, and this goes to the point of new products and new lines of business for the company, right? So they spent almost 4.4 billion this quarter, compared to 3.8 billion the quarter before, 3.8 billion the quarter before, 3.8 billion the quarter before, 3.8 billion the quarter before. You get the picture, right?
Yep.
So very flat. And when I say OPEX, just for people listening, if you're not familiar with the term, I mean their total operating expenses, which includes R&D, it includes their general and administrative. So it's their total spending other than the cost of manufacturing devices. So it's ramped up. And it's going to stay ramped up according to their guidance. And on the call, when somebody asked about that, and this was one of my primary questions too that I would have asked if I was on the call, is what's going on? Like, is this just a higher expense level, or are you starting to spend on stuff we haven't seen yet? And they said it a couple of times that no, this is spending on R&D that is not visible to you guys yet. So whether it be mobile payment related, whether it be games on iOS, bringing it to the Apple TV, I don't know what else it is, but there's obviously stuff that Apple has going on that they haven't told us about that they think is significant. And when I say that they think it's significant, I mean they're backing it up with hundreds of millions of dollars of additional spending. They wouldn't be doing that if they didn't think it was big. So if you want to assume that these guys are going to hit the same kind of OPEX ratios in the future, it does imply that they think they're going to grow significantly, which is a big factor of the way that's how I look at stocks. When I look at a business, I look at what's going on in the future. I don't really care that much about the quarter-to-quarter stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting to me because, and I posed this question this weekend. It's the 30th anniversary of the Mac. It's roughly 7 years since the iPhone came out. It's about 4 years since the iPad came out. Steve Jobs legendarily went on the stage and he said, "Today, Apple revolutionizes the phone." And just in terms of the sheer size of business, it seems like the market expects Apple to be like a movie studio and have a blockbuster release after blockbuster release. But I'm hard-pressed to say Apple can come out and say, "Today we revolutionize the blank," because watch doesn't seem as big as phone. Even television doesn't seem like as big a business for Apple as phone. So I don't know if it's iBeacon and the Internet of Things, or it's a bunch of small things that collectively make a big thing. But I'm hard-pressed to see, like I can see things like the watch and the TV, absolutely, but I don't know if we'll see that moment that, you get the chills again and you realize nothing is going to be the same.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and that's either because there isn't something huge for them to just go and launch and dominate a brand new product category that's going to be so significant.
What's as important to you, Chris, as your phone or your computer that Apple could get into?
Well, that's it. I mean, like, they're humongous categories that they're already dominant in. So what else is it going to be? They could dominate other categories, but will those other categories be as financially relevant to the company? It's hard to say, right? I mean, between you and I, we can't think of something that they would do that would just be so overwhelmingly incredible that it would drive their financials to a whole new level. So it's either that they're
replace phone functionality for me. The watch will be nice, but it won't be as important as my phone.
And that's what I mean. Like, it's either that there isn't something big enough to matter, or we just don't know what it is because we're not that clever.
They mentioned iBeacons again.
I'm willing to buy that second argument. I'm willing to say, hey, I am not a product designer, so what do I know, right? We'll see.
Well, I mean, like they said iBeacons have been deployed now to all the U.S. app stores, and other retailers are interested. They said the NFL is now using iPads to replace all their playbooks. We know Major League Baseball rolled out iBeacons at some of their stadiums. It looks to me like there could be almost, instead of a single thing, a web of things that become far more valuable than any one of them separately.
Oh yeah, and I do think that the whole idea of financial payments could be massive because it's not really a thing. It's this intangible, but Jesus, there are a lot of money obviously happening. I mean, you've got people who can afford expensive iPhones and expensive iPads going out and buying expensive things or just buying a lot of not so expensive things, and Apple taking a cut of the transaction every single time, just like the credit card companies. One possibility, or whatever, I'm not sure, but obviously e-commerce is a huge, and when I say e-commerce, I mean using your phone to buy something in an actual store or buying something online. I'm just classifying it all as e-commerce because you're using some sort of electronic gadget to help you with the transaction. I think there's a lot of money there, and there's a lot of money to be made, and so it doesn't necessarily need to be a whole new product category, something that you go and buy from Apple to make Apple even richer than they are now.
So one of the interesting things that I see there, sorry, I was just got distracted by the chat room. They just asked if the expenses include the billions for the new spaceship campus.
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't, because that would be property, plant, and equipment. That would go under. That would be an asset purchase that would get amortized over the lifetime of the asset.
So the other thing that Tim Cook raised, and I lost track of it in here now. Oh, it was. And this smacks of elitism, and a lot of people don't like addressing it, but Apple repeated it sort of as nicely as they could twice. They said first that Apple customers have proven they buy more over iOS than anybody else, and they also said that developers make more on the platform than anybody else, and that sort of raises the specter of iOS customers being more valuable, whether it is to retailers or it is to developers. That is sort of secondary money for Apple, and I don't know how you feel about that, Chris. Is there an argument to be made that, yes, there's maybe a bigger market share for non-Apple devices, but Apple is the one providing the money to people at the end of the day?
Oh, definitely. I mean, if you're making more money as a developer on iOS, then obviously Apple is making more money too. And I mean, that's going to be a big factor for developers to develop for iOS before they develop for Android. And I think, I don't know what the current metrics are, but would you say it's still pretty much par for the course that developers put out their iOS app before they launch Android?
Apple singled out several of them, especially game companies. We've been seeing it go back and forth a little bit, but they mentioned, for example, Plants vs. Zombies had the biggest release in history. They had millions of downloads while they were still iOS exclusive. That Clumsy Ninja was incredibly successful as an iOS exclusive. Mm-hmm. I think the perception might be shifting, that just by sheer numbers, the perception is becoming that Android. And this is another question I have for you. The car market gets broken down. Like, very seldom do you hear an analyst go, "Oh, Chery in China outsold BMW, ha ha ha." But the smartphone market, not only do they not consider it the phone market yet, even though most phones are becoming smart, but there's no segmentation going on yet. No one's like saying Apple has 0% of the under $400 phone market, but they have a huge percentage of the over $600 phone market.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's certainly not as mature of an industry as the automobile industry, so they don't have, I guess we just don't see the same kind of stats being, I mean, maybe someone's publishing them. I don't know. It's going to mature over time, but I think right now it's just that there's still, it's sort of like, there's still a bunch of people driving around in horse and buggies, so only half the market is on actual internal combustion engine powered vehicle at this point, the smartphone, right? And so we're focused on car market share and car market share in each country as opposed to pricing tiers. And eventually that'll change. The more and more the market matures, the more data that's going to come out on different pricing tiers, etc.
So one of the things Apple said that was a bit cheeky was they were talking about adoption rates, and iOS 7 is now on 80% of iOS devices. They probably mean current devices, because a lot of devices are simply, like the original iPhone is not on the market anymore, and there's probably very few in use. But 80% of iPhones are 80% of iOS devices that are currently being used are running iOS 7 based on App Store statistics. And they said that KitKat adoption, the latest version of Android, is still in the single digits. Now it is, no pun intended, an apples to oranges comparison, but they said based on these numbers, iOS 7 because everyone always says Android is way more popular than iOS, but Apple's point was iOS 7 is way more popular than any single version of Android on the market.
Yeah, and in fact, didn't they say that iOS 7 is the most popular OS in the world?
Yes, I believe.
Yeah.
I don't know if they meant mobile or if they think iOS 7 is more popular than, for example, Windows XP. I don't know.
I noticed that they said popular OS. They didn't say mobile OS, which had me thinking back. I wrote an article for WP Central, Windows Phone Central, on Friday talking about what's going on with Microsoft and the future of them in the consumer market, or are they going to kind of eventually bail on the consumer market, sort of like BlackBerry did, to focus exclusively on enterprise, because Microsoft isn't nearly as strong in the consumer market as they once were. And somebody pointed out, well, Windows is still the #1 OS in the world. Well, yeah, but if you break it down by version and all that, it's not really true anymore, I guess. And Windows Phone, or sorry, iOS 7, to your point, Rene, I think you're right. Absolutely. Apple has done an amazing job of just pushing out. I don't know how they do it when other guys can't seem to do it, but
you have BlackBerry paying there, right?
Yeah. Oh man, big time. I mean, all these years you're going, okay, why can't you guys just roll out? Well, we need the carrier approval. We need Apple just says, screw you, we're pushing the button. Everyone's getting iOS 7 now. Done. I mean, so KitKat, I'm running on this phone here. I'm expecting it to show up in the screen, but of course I'm looking at the live version. Anyway, this phone, Galaxy S4, it's pretty much a brand new phone, and it's running. I guess it's Jelly Bean, right?
Yeah.
The one that came before KitKat. Well, unless I do some funky stuff to download a copy that I'm not supposed to be using yet, Samsung just hasn't released it yet, because I guess it goes open source, and then each vendor kind of goes, oh, okay, now we're going to tweak it according to our in-house apps that we put on top of it, and our in-house UI that we put on top of it, and eventually we'll release it. So it takes a long time, right? And Apple has a speedier process, and it's a better process, and customers love it. I mean, no question. I mean, every time an OS comes out from Apple, I go to my wife's iPhone, just boom, update, done, and she's thrilled with it, right? No messing around.
Yeah, the only side effect of that is that we have way less hardware variety to choose from than Android, because it can go on so many different devices. Yeah, they don't get updated as much, but you can get, I think Samsung alone has 1,000,005 different screen sizes, and
oh, yeah,
all sorts of form factors and shapes and flavors and whatnot.
Yeah, and that might be another one of these reasons why people are launching on iOS first, because it's simpler. I mean, there's just less work to do to launch your app there. You know that there's a market. You know that it's a market of people who have their credit card on file with Apple and can just touch their phone to buy your stuff.
So sort of to finish up, Chris, it looks like there's tremendous opportunity for Apple, but there's still an incredible disconnect between them and the market. For example, there was a question about innovation. They get hammered for new product categories. We spoke a little bit about that. Tim Cook finished up the call by saying that the way that Apple could, they said that Apple does not have a problem thinking of categories to innovate. They can make up endless lists of these categories, but their problem is figuring out the one. They could disrupt all these categories, but their problem is figuring out the ones that deserve their total focus and attention. That they want to do almost in that old Charles Emerson Winchester from MASH thing: one thing at a time, do it very, very well, and then move on. But does Apple have to start getting worried about the perception, no matter how inaccurate they feel it to be?
I don't think so. I mean, if I was to put myself in the shoes of a public company executive, like a CEO, like Tim Cook or something, if you're thinking long term and you realize that your stock's going to be highly volatile, Wall Street's going to hate you for sometimes 2 years at a time, and that's fine. I mean, it's happened in Netflix with the Quickster fiasco. I was just writing about that today, so it's on top of my mind. You get hated on for doing something that you believe in. Sometimes you make a mistake and you admit it and you reverse course, like Reed Hastings did with the Quickster thing. Sometimes you're right and you just go, screw it, I don't care about the whims of Wall Street. Wall Street wants me to squeeze every penny out of my business next quarter, right? That's what they want. That's all they care about. I mean, let's say next quarter / next year.
Carl Icahn just wants all the money out of Apple he can.
Oh yeah, I mean it's horrible. But if you're running a business for the long term, you have to think about these big innovative waves of product that you're gonna reinvent. And whether it's the phone and then the tablet, and I mean, first the music player and the PC, of course, back to the Mac, and then you've got all of this stuff. Like maybe their big focus is now on mobile payments. Maybe they're saying, finally, we have hundreds of millions of credit cards on file. We've got devices that people can just touch and pay. We've got iBeacon technology. We've got all of these toolkits ready to go. All we have to do is implement them in a way that makes it so freaking easy for people to buy stuff and somehow adds value to the vendor, whether it be analytics or whatever it is, and we take our fair share of that. Boom. I mean, maybe that's the next big focus. Maybe it's TV. Maybe it's, reinventing media somehow. I don't know what it is, but I am willing to bet on a company any day that takes a long-term focus and doesn't dick around and worry about what Wall Street thinks and just does what it knows is best. I mean, because that's the kind of company I would rather own, I would rather run, I would rather invest in, whatever it is. I would certainly not blame Apple for ignoring Wall Street and saying, fine, they'll be pissed at us for a couple of years. That's okay.
So what are you looking for from Apple for the next quarter, Chris? I know the guidance wasn't what Wall Street wanted, and it's traditionally a softer quarter after the massive holiday one. What are the signs that you're looking for?
Oh, well, I mean, revenue and earnings and all that stuff, they laid out their guidance pretty well, and they usually deliver pretty much within the window that they've set.
They've gotten really good at guidance in the last few
quarters. So I mean, like, I'm not going to say anything there about financially speaking what do I expect. I expect them to deliver more or less what they said they would. Nothing there. But I think that we're going to start to get more signals from them about what's coming, right? People like guys like you who are digging into this stuff every day, and other great sites that that iMore competes with, right? Or slash whatever plays in the same industry with. Maybe compete is the wrong word, right? Because it's a very friendly rivalry across all these sites that do a great job of reporting the news and the rumors and the analysis. But I'm thinking that we're going to get more insight, and maybe not even this quarter, but sometime during 2014, I think it's going to become more clear what Apple's plans are, both with the Apple TV, whether it be a set-top box or something else, and with the mobile payments. And that, to me, is going to be very, very interesting. I'm not so interested in, somebody was quoted as saying, oh, well, now the attention is going to shift to the iPhone 6. Yeah, that's Wall Street. That's their what can you do for me next quarter mantra. That's not really important. I mean, there'll be another iPhone, there'll be more iPads, there'll be updated Macs. We're at a pretty much a point here where the products are mature, but maybe what we're doing with them still has lots of room to grow and innovate, right? And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking to find out what's that next angle. Tim has made obviously a big bet on R&D because they've stepped it up and they're keeping the pedal to the metal. Something's coming out of that probably this year. I just don't know exactly what.
So 2012 they had the textbook event, and then they had the iPad 3 event. 2011 they had the Verizon iPhone and the iPad 2 event. Last year Apple was quiet until WWDC in June. Can they afford to be quiet again? Would you rather hear something from them sooner than later?
Oh yeah, I mean, can they, again, it comes back to the same point about Wall Street versus running your business. If from a business standpoint, consumers, your buyers are going to freak out and like you're going to lose market share because of it, then yeah, they can't afford it. But that's pretty rare. Like, you don't really see the consumer market, the average consumer, with his eyes glued to the screen, figuring out what the headlines are on Apple and making buying decisions based on that. When it comes to Wall Street, can they afford, from their stocks perspective, to wait until June to do something big? Yeah, they can afford it. It might hurt, it might sting, but really, in the long run, who cares? I certainly don't. I'm a shareholder for the long term.
One last question from Neil Douglas in the chat room, and Tim Cook actually spoke about this on the ABC interview earlier. Sapphire glass in Arizona, they're getting into it. Does that excite you, Chris?
It's a product feature, I guess. It means harder, hard to scratch screens. It sounds really cool. I guess, is anyone doing that yet? No.
I know Apple's doing it on the Touch ID sensor and the iSight camera lens top.
Yeah.
But the whole screen would certainly be interesting. I think it's still an expensive technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cool thing. To me, I have never had a problem with screen scratching, so I don't understand it as like this main driver. But could it be, again, logic and emotion are two totally different things, right? So from a logical perspective, I could say, well, it really doesn't make that much of a difference.
Maybe watches scratch more easily than phones, Chris.
Yeah, well, that's it. And I mean, it would certainly be more economical to put a really hard surface like that on something small like a watch than a phone. But I mean, I keep this phone in, I mean, it's just a regular phone, whatever. I keep it in my pocket with my keys and my coins. It doesn't scratch. I've never looked at the screen and gone, oh my goodness, there's a scratch. I can't use this anymore out the window.
First nerd problem.
I'm not excited by it, but I understand that you need something to differentiate your marketing. So that's
awesome.
That's normal.
All right, Chris, so if people want to find more of your writings, if they want to follow you on Twitter, where can they go?
Umiastowski is my Twitter handle, or Umiastowski if you want to pronounce it like someone from the Slavic nations. That's fine. And iMore, Crackberry, WP Central, Android Central. I write articles for you guys all the time. So find me on Twitter is probably the most convenient, though.
And they can look for an editorial on all the stuff from you later on?
Yeah, I'm thinking I'll publish it sometime tomorrow morning.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Rene.
You can find me at Rene Ritchie. You can find all of us at imore.com. Stay tuned. We have a lot more to come.